Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Megan Peasley, and I am the Iowa Sourceling Program Coordinator at the University of Northern Iowa's John Papajohn Entrepreneurial Center. Here we work with the Iowa Economic Authority to bring the Iowa Sourceling platform to all business owners. Whether you're looking to start, grow, fund, or even exit your business, Iowa SourceLink is here to help you. We provide step-by-step guides, make helpful referrals to our nearly 400 partners, and house the Business License Information Center. We also have the privilege of presenting these webinars in partnership with our resource partners. Today's webinar will cover employee-owned cooperatives, strategies and insights for alternative solutions to your clients' business succession challenges. The Drake University Law School's Entrepreneurial and Transactional Law Clinic will lead our webinar today. Before we get into that, I have a few housekeeping items. First, today's webinar is being recorded and will be available within the next week. You will receive a link to today's recording in the same email that you will receive as proof of your attendance. The slides for today's webinar will be shared momentarily in the chat box by Sophie Troxel. Sophie and I will be sharing other resources and contact information if and when they're brought up during the webinar in the chat box. Finally, please enter any questions that you may have into the Q&A box located in the bottom half of your screen. We do ask that you focus on asking general questions that could apply to everyone. If you have a question specific to your situation, we recommend that you talk to the Drake University Law School Entrepreneurial and Transactional Law Clinic directly. We are going to hold off on answering the questions that come through until the very end. And if there isn't enough time to get through all the questions today, don't worry. All of your questions will be sent to our panel along with your contact information. And with that, I am going to invite Nick, Roby, and Debra Pettit to lead us through today's webinar. Nick is a clinical professor of law at Drake University Law School, and Debra is a project attorney for Empower Rural Iowa Initiative and the Entrepreneurial and Transactional Clinic. Nick and Debra, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, and good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity for Nick and I to share our interest and passion for spreading the word in Iowa about the alternative of employee-owned cooperatives. As Megan introduced myself and Nick, I am a 30-year practicing attorney in the state of Iowa. My background is varied, initially serving as a trial attorney at now Denton Davis Brown. And then serving as in-house counsel, general counsel for an small Iowa manufacturing business for approximately 7 years, and now practicing at my own law firm. At the same time, I have joined the Drake Legal Clinic, as Megan mentioned, as a special project attorney focused on, for lack of a better word, becoming an expert on employee-owned cooperatives, how they're formed, organized, and how they can be useful in the state of Iowa. Initially, what Nick and I would like for you to take away, primarily 3 goals of sharing employee-owned cooperative information with you here today. Initially, simply to let you know what is an employee-owned cooperative. Secondly, why is it important in particular as a different form of ownership for employees? And thirdly, how do you go about addressing employee-owned cooperative questions, whether you're a group of employees or whether you have a client that's interested in transitioning out of their business, and whether this might be an alternative for either of those situations.
Right. Thanks, Debra. I'm Nick Roby. I'm the director of the Entrepreneurial and Transactional Clinic and a clinical professor here at Drake Law School. So before we get into the specialty here, let me back up and do just a brief commercial with respect to our general practice at the ETC. We represent targeted small businesses and community nonprofit organizations. We have student attorneys who are sworn in at the beginning of the semester. and represent those small businesses and community nonprofits with respect to organizational and transactional and tax planning and tax exemption work. And as a part of that, we were approached by Empower Rural Iowa and the Lieutenant Governor's Office to assist the state and the Rural Iowa Empowerment Committee on ways in which we could assist in facilitating, the state's initiative in helping smaller rural areas maintain their businesses and their business environment. So employee-owned co-op was something no one knew much about. The state realized that and said, we need some folks to sort of spend some time studying it, acquainting the business people and professionals in the state with this concept, because it has been used in other states as one method in which retiring business people can find a successor to their business. And sometimes it works out as an ideal successor. And so we want to get the word out to the folks so that you have general understanding of it and you know where to look further. And if you represent folks who have a situation where this is a good fit.
Okay, initially, as a general concept, what is an employee-owned cooperative? Typically when you think of a cooperative, you think of cooperatives that exist in Iowa in the agricultural center, farm co-ops, or in the utility sector, electrical co-ops. That's something that worker or employee-owned cooperatives, they all have in common, basically, that they're an autonomous association of persons that unite voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs. And through the key is to jointly own and democratically controlled. So that's common to all cooperatives. When we're talking about employee-owned cooperatives, three primary tenets or facets of employee-owned cooperatives is that they're member-owned, they're member-run, and that they're member-serving. Member-owned in employee-owned cooperatives, eligibility is generally limited to the pool of employees for that entity. Member managed, they're democratically managed, typically one person, one vote is the tenant with respect to the management of an employee-owned cooperative. Those voting rights can be done to elect a serving board of members or board of directors. And then the third basic factor or tenet for an EOC is that they're member serving, with the profits generally equitably distributed based on patronage or their investments in labor, rather than through the typical capital investment in an entity. The EOC, similar again to your typical agricultural utility cooperative, in addition to those three primary facets of the EOC, which is the membership, the control, and the participation, all of those co-ops are based historically on 7 cooperative principles, which also include the autonomy and independence of the cooperative, a focus on education and training with their members, cooperation among other similar cooperative entities, and then focused on a concern for the resilience and the vibrancy of the community that they serve.
With respect to there are other types of employee ownership. And when we're talking about employee ownership here, we're mostly talking about broad-based employee ownership. There are certainly other structures which could use the term employee owned, even though it's top management or just a select group, minority group of the employee force who are owners of the business. And certainly there's a place for that. But professionals in Iowa and other places are kind of more familiar with management buyouts and having a retiring owner sell his or her membership interest or stock to one or more select insider management folks. And so we'll spend some time on that, but we're not going to. That's kind of well recognized in Iowa and other places. So that's not where we focus. There are other also broad-based ownership structures like employee stock ownership plans. They are, although very specialized in a very specialized niche, they are more certainly commonplace in Iowa than the employee-owned cooperative. Reportedly, there's 150-ish of employee stock ownership plan companies in Iowa, and we have professionals that have grown up around that and are available to advise those companies who have those plans, those retirement plans that invest in employer securities as well. And so again, not as much need there to get the word out, to get a general understanding of how those things work. Employee stock ownership plans, really because of the cost and the annual maintenance and professionals that need to be involved, are a little more expensive to run and operate. So you need a decent sized group of eligible employees as indirect owners. Sometimes that number has been said to be 50. Maybe you could go a little bit smaller than that, but not too much smaller. And the transaction costs and the maintenance costs are just too expensive to operate that. So not perfect for smaller Main Street businesses, which may be better suited for other structures of employee ownership, which include the concept of employee-owned trusts, which are not very well known in Iowa or across the country, frankly. That's kind of a European sort of concept. It's big in Great Britain and other places in Europe, but not so much in Iowa, although there does seem to be some increased interest in that. And maybe eventually we will see that. It's kind of a cross between an employee stock ownership plan and where there's indirect ownership and a trustee representing those indirect owners, and the employee-owned co-op where you have direct ownership by the employees. So we're going to spend our time today kind of hopefully familiarizing you with the third broad-based employee ownership type, and that's the employee-owned or worker-owned co-op.
And why are we focusing on this? As Nick mentioned, that we're part of a partnership with the Empower Rural Iowa team to raise awareness about employee ownership in general and employee-owned cooperatives in particular. And the main factor of, or one of the main factors that we're interested in this is the metaphor of the silver tsunami that's, hitting not only Iowa, but the United States. That essentially describes the aging of the baby boomer generation and the impact it's having currently on society. The statistics show that over half of the business owners in the U.S. are currently 55 or older, that less than 30% will transition as those retire to their families, and only 20% of those businesses will sell. A more particularized breakdown of the age of those owners. This is, I think, from 2021, but those statistics show that approximately 25% of current business owners, again, across the United States, are 45 to 54 years, and then almost 30% 55 to 64 years, and then 22% of small business owners 65 years or older. This again emphasizing the impact of the age of the current business owners and what are the alternatives to those business owners, either if there's not an alternative to transitioning to their family, perhaps transitioning to their employees as employee owners is another way to keep their doors open.
Right, because the alternatives are one that's not too appetizing to the state and to the community, right? So obviously, selling to out-of-state bigger companies is certainly an alternative that's taken by some retiring businessmen. That sometimes works. Sometimes that ends up being a short-term situation, and then the out-of-state owner closes down the local Iowa-based business and moves it to whatever bigger city or bigger or other community they're in. So not perfect. Other times, you know, a buyer's just not found with respect to the entire business as a going concern. So the hard assets are liquidated and the business closes down. And of course, then the economics that are generated by that business and the jobs that it had are not, and then lost to the community. So state's very interested in this, and the community should be very interested in finding ways to keep businesses open, and in many cases, the preferred is locally owned.
With respect to, in particular to Iowa, again, our interest in small businesses in Iowa, the current makeup is that 99% of all businesses in Iowa are small businesses that employ approximately 50% of the state's workforce. As we've been discussing, the employee-owned cooperative is a good alternative as those substantial number of business owners retire. The employee ownership model allows those business owners to preserve their legacy, to receive market value for that business. There are potential tax benefits that Nick will discuss towards the end of this presentation that may be available when there's a transition to employee ownership. And then more importantly, retaining those employees in that community. Some more statistics, other than that community resilience. On the community side, on the individual side, the benefits for the employees, typically employee ownership shows higher wages, longer job tenure, and higher household net worth for those employees that are working in an employee-owned structure. As we've been along for this endeavor almost a year and a half in focusing on raising awareness of employee-owned cooperatives and trying to serve any clients that are interested in that here at the clinic. What we have identified early on and have become acquainted with is that there is currently only one employee-owned cooperative in the state of Iowa, and that's Morning Bell Coffee Roasters out of Ames, Iowa. What we have learned from studying and doing a case study on Morning Bell Coffee Roasters is that before we were engaged in this process, really if a transitioning owner or the employees were interested in employee-owned cooperative, there was really not a lot of information out there. And in this case, Nadeem Mir really took the initiative independently to allow that to come to fruition in 2022. And we thought we'd just share with you a little bit about his story because it's inspiring and interesting. He recently spoke at the UNI's or Iowa CEO's annual employee ownership conference a few weeks ago. And he had this to share. And again, we share this with you as background for really the initiative he took without the resources that we now offer through the clinic and through the other resources in Iowa.
So that certainly further evidences what we're saying here, that in this instance, kind of the free market doesn't work in developing businesses that are going to transition to employee-owned co-ops and professionals who understand it and who can advise businesses with respect to that. So the state, we think, was very prudent in thinking ahead in kind of funding different groups, including the Great Law School and UNI's business extension programs, to do some groundwork to, again, to get the basics understood and get some forms prepared and some information available and distributed to communities and the professionals in those communities, so that others won't have to start from scratch or nothing in figuring this all out.
And as a follow-up, even though, as you heard, Morning Bell Coffee Roasters had a little bit of a rough road with their ingenuity, they accomplished it. They're still running as an employee-owned cooperative today in Ames. And so the model has worked well for that business. Just a summary again of what those advantages of such an employee-owned cooperative are: increased productivity, enhanced employee retention, the financial benefits for the employees themselves of having that stake in the ownership of where they work, the business resilience. I know in other communities or other states, not in Iowa, through the COVID downturn, the worker cooperatives had good resilience during that crisis. And then the collaborative culture of ownership is another advantage of employee ownership. With respect to, we learned, what is employee ownership? Why is it important? Why is the Drake Legal Clinic involved? And now really we want to give you kind of, based on our experience in this process so far, about raising awareness and building the roadmap for employee-owned cooperatives. What's the best model if a group of employees is interested, if a retiring business owner is interested in transitioning ownership, to the employees. How do we go about it? Overall, really, from our perspective, because it's a little different kind of business transition, it's really important to have a collaboration between a business advisor, a legal advisor, and a financial advisor. And in this context, the ETC, the Drake Legal Clinic, is offering free legal services to our students to work with that transition. And then, as Nick mentioned, the premier center for the business planning side of it is the Iowa CEO.
Right, so the Iowa Center for Employee Ownership was created relatively recently and is housed at University of Northern Iowa's AdvanceIowa location in Cedar Falls. And again, they provide directly at AdvanceIowa as well as through the Iowa CEO, which has its own 15 or 18 member advisory committee, and holds conferences and has a website that has some good information on various kinds of employee ownership. So those groups are available kind of on the business consulting and structuring side to assist businesses or employee groups or both in analyzing whether this makes sense. They certainly have contacts to the extent there is more extensive consulting, valuation, and other professional services needed on the non-legal side. They would they're very adept at finding those resources to help in that regard.
This team generally, just a few points on when such a team is working with, again, either a selling business owner or a potential group of employees that wants to form an employee-owned cooperative. Really, it's important to think about the timing of that engagement because it's a relatively new concept with a lot of moving parts and information that needs to be shared with the potential employee owners. Getting contacted at the planning stage or if an accountant has, or an attorney has a long-term business owner that's coming up with a retirement plan, this is one alternative that can be shared with them at those initial stages. And then just anticipating that it is a longer timeline, a process, again, because it takes education of the importance or the key concepts with not only the selling business owners, but also with the potential incoming employee owners. The scope of the engagement, can range depending on who's involved in the process. You'll have the potential buying employees who might form a separate buying entity. Then of course you have the selling business owner, the selling entity, and then its individual owners that all might need education, consultation, and representation. And it's often the case with respect to employee ownership that the individual owners might stay involved in the company for a few years to aid in that transition, either serving on the board or with a separate employee contract. During those initial consultations, from our current study of those businesses or those groups that might be a good fit for employee ownership, these are some of the considerations that may make them a good fit or not a good fit. As Nick mentioned earlier, ESOPs are typically for the larger group of employees. Employee-owned cooperatives fit well with a smaller group of full-time employees that perhaps have been long-term employees, so they understand the nature of the business, can ease better into the ownership based on their managerial level. And then also, obviously, the financial condition of the seller entity itself, depending on that transition, as distinct from other types of entities. The member employees are going to need to buy in and purchase that entity So those financial considerations are important.
Now, I've seen case studies and reports that employee-owned co-ops in other states have been formed with just a very small number of employees, 2, 3, 4. And maybe that works, in communities where it's been tried, it's more tried and true, and people understand it a little better. I'm not sure that seems ideal to me here in Iowa, where we're still in the infancy stage. I mean, I think that type of a very small micro business, at least with respect to number of employees, can negotiate with those employees individually, the exiting, retiring business owner, and negotiate a sale, perhaps with that very small group of employees. As the number grows a bit towards the double digits and into the double digits, then there may be reasons why the employee-owned co-op makes more sense, particularly in a business where it's got a team culture and everyone's kind of in it for themselves as well as other members of the team. And there's some, again, team spirit there in which there will not be troublesome cultural issues with kind of the equal sharing of the equity in the business if it's pursued in that direction.
With respect to the culture, we did learn from Morning Bell Coffee Roasters and again, doing a case study on them, the culture, the number of employees was 5 or 6. It's worked well. And partly, I know they mentioned part-time baristas, but it also had long-term, full-time employees where Nadeed had really invested in their knowledge of the company and the management of the company. So it made that transition with respect to the knowledge and the nature of the employees work well for them. Nick had already discussed when I'm talking about that advisor team, one very important component of that advisor team is the current Iowa Center for Employee Ownership. As he mentioned, they are dedicated to promoting and expanding employee ownership across Iowa. And although AdvanceIowa has been working on this for several years, recently, the Iowa Center for Employee Ownership became the 21st state that is part of the Employee Ownership Expansion Network, which is a resource at the end of the show. That's one of the resources if someone's interested in employee ownership. The Iowa CEO website and the Employee Ownership Expansion Network website has a wealth of background information, as well as the ability to do direct consultations with either Stacy Mullenix or Debra Rectenbaugh that have been working with potential employee-owned groups and employee owners to transition to employee-owned cooperatives. Here at the Drake Legal Clinic, we see ourselves as the second component of that advisor team. We're the legal advising component of that team. And as Nick explained in the introduction, our services come from the Drake Clinic, the ETC Clinic, where we're basically operating as a student attorney law firm. As we have either referrals from the Iowa Center for Employee Ownership, for lack of a better word, or other individual clients who learn about our services, one of the components of what we're doing is assisting those clients as part of that collaborative team to determine whether they're a good fit for employee-owned cooperatives. And then as we progress, we'll be able to do the organizational and the governing documents for that employee-owned cooperative from the legal services free of charge here at the Drake Clinic.
And with our funding from the state, we've been able to open up a few more seats, student attorney spots in our clinic, in which we get volunteers after explaining the program of those third-year law students who have an interest in services in smaller communities in Iowa, and particularly this employee ownership model. And so they're kind of our employee-owned cooperative specialists, and they're able to work closely with Debra as their faculty supervisor and do a couple of things. One is, again, produce materials, including forms and so forth, that would be available for folks who are going down this road. And then secondly, to provide direct representation of groups and sometimes in collaboration with or as co-counsel with other local counsel or other counsel that are involved with the group. We certainly are not there to compete with the private practicing attorneys or other business professionals. We're there to sort of complement that and provide that assistance on an economical basis, right? If we don't charge our clients for those services. So we're just part of that team as we, again, try to grow the understanding and the need for the services across the state.
And just to emphasize, one of the things that we've done as part of this program is we have developed specific legal forms and templates that are available as part of our resource partner on the Iowa Sourcing website, as well as can be accessed directly from the Drake Legal Clinic as well. And we're happy to share those forms, and we're happy to collaborate on those forms. For some general legal background with respect to the statutory source for employee-owned cooperatives in Iowa, or the authorizing legal framework, in very general terms, a cooperative, an employee-owned cooperative is not specifically defined business entity currently in Iowa for legal purposes. Rather, you can form an employee-owned cooperative from a legal perspective, based on really any business structure in the Iowa Code.
And one of our initial projects at the state really asked us to look at was whether it was appropriate at this time to urge the legislature to adopt a specific worker-owned cooperative statute. So an enabling statute like our Business Corporation Act or our Limited Liability Company Act, and obviously some co-op act, that would address specifically worker-owned co-ops. Some other states have those; they're in the minority. But at least at this time, we concluded it probably doesn't make sense. There are other ways in which it can be done, and some additional information needs to be accumulated, we thought, with respect to businesses where this works and where maybe we thought it did and it doesn't, or other things that could help us craft a worker-owned co-op statute that really works and makes sense and cuts through some of the specialized provisions that you otherwise have to put into your organizational documents if they're not there in the statute. So for those reasons, we weren't urging that legislature take that initiative right now and copy or nearly copy another state's worker-owned co-op that had, in those states that have had a lot of more experience with the type of entity. So that's where we are today without a specific authorizing statute. But as Debra pointed out, there's plenty of ways to sort of get to where we want to be with respect to these organizations.
And in that regard, you're really, whether it's the two potential scenarios where you have a group of employees that want to start an employee-owned cooperative, or you have an existing small business that wants to transition ownership to its employees in the form of an employee-owned cooperative. In either scenario, currently, based on where we're at in this process, we really think the limited liability company entity structure works well for either the transition from one entity to another, or as a startup to form an employee-owned cooperative.
Right, and we kind of came to that conclusion independently, but we've sort of felt good that it's sort of been the conclusion that other consultants and folks in the industry in those states that have more activity have, it appears to be that where they're concluding too, again, if their state doesn't have a specific statute, that limited liability company statute, because of its flexibility, because it allows you to do almost anything you want within the operating agreement to set forth the rules governing ownership and operations and so forth. But that really fits pretty well, assuming you, and here's the trick, you can draft those things artfully and exactly in those governing documents so that it says what you want it to say and it works the way you want it to work. Whereas other forms of business entities, business corporations under Chapter 490, specific co-op statutes that were drafted not with the worker-owned co-op in mind, although maybe you definitely can make them fit, but they weren't intended for that. They were intended for production or utility type co-ops, or producer or utility co-op. So again, taking into account all those factors, we can come back to the LLC form of state law entity as being the most appropriate and one we can work with, we think the best to fit for these type of organizations.
In that regard, if we're talking about a recommended LLC entity, because it fits under the circumstances of the person's interested in forming a worker cooperative, what we can do both with form documents that we've developed here or with specific documents to the client's situation is develop those organizational and governing documents for that LLC that if I take you back to the beginning, where we talked about the worker cooperative principles that make it a worker cooperative, really each of those documents then need to incorporate that employee is employee owned, employee run, and employee serving. And so those principles are incorporated in a membership application, wherein at the transition stage, each of them current eligible employees complete a membership application to become or a subscription agreement to become an owner of the existing or new LLC. Then the operating agreement itself will incorporate those three principles about member eligibility, the governance by the employees, and then the profit distribution by the employees. We found as well that it makes sense in this unique situation where the employee members are running the business. Maybe it needs to be simplified from the standard legalese operating agreement to narrow that down into separating kind of operating rules handbook for those employees so that they can understand their ownership interests and their ownership's rights on a more readable or simple level. So those are the types of documents that we've put together in a standardized form at the clinic, and that would serve to create or transition to an employee-owned cooperative.
And again, we think that's the best fit. We haven't had time to do all the variations thereof, right? If you were dealing with a business corporation that had been in existence for a number of decades and it was to be transitioned to an employee-owned co-op, either through a conversion or acquisition type transaction. And again, there were reasons why you wanted to keep that state law business corporation in place. You could do that. You would have to then use some of those same co-op provisions that we've spread throughout the operating agreement and the operating rules into the bylaws, perhaps articles of incorporation in some cases, and other governing documents of that business corporation. The same thing is true with respect to a specialized co-op corporation under a different statute of Iowa law. And again, it can all be done, but we had to start somewhere, and we think the most useful and common type of structure would be the limited liability company structure.
And these types of documents can also be transferred or manipulated as well if it is a corporate entity instead of a limited liability company. The documents can be transitioned. The key with respect to employee ownership is that you incorporate those excuse me, those principles of member run, member serving, and member owned. Excuse me. This is just an example of if there is a small business owner that is in the form of an LLC, what does that transition look like? And here it's essentially that you have the individual owners of the current LLC entering into a purchase agreement from the LLC, basically for a redemption of their shares to the LLC. And then on the right-hand side, you have each of the employee members entering into a subscription agreement to purchase their individual ownership shares into the LLC. Now, not all employees, for context of federal tax law purposes, there needs to be a certain percentage of eligible employees that enter into those subscription agreements, but not all employees have to become owners and can still be an employee of the employee-owned cooperative outside of ownership if they choose not to enter into a subscription agreement and buy a piece of the ownership into the new employee-owned cooperative.
And conversely, not all owners have to be employees. It does get a little more complicated when you have non-employee owners and employee-owned co-op. But you might have that situation, especially with a successor arrangement where the current retiring owner is selling to the employee group. There are reasons perhaps that you may want to structure that in pieces rather than 100% sale on day one. And both state law and tax law with certain limits and thresholds will allow that to happen. There's some tricks and some specialty things that need to be taken into account about what it is that the selling retiring owner is left with if they're only selling a portion of their interest or stock to the group or back to the company, which is then funded by partially by subscriptions from the group and then other funding. But again, those can be worked through about how you can get comfortable depending on what tax result you're looking for as to what that type of interest, whether it's a preferred stock type interest or something else, but that can be handled in that case.
And I think Nick just discussed as well. Aside from the governing documents, these are the transaction documents that we at the clinic might be able to assist with in part of that team for an employee-owned cooperative formation. Again, the membership purchase agreement from the existing owners to sell their current ownership to the LLC, the subscription agreements between the employees and the continuing LLC. And then perhaps if there's a promissory note that needs to be involved in the transaction.
Which then brings up the point that, you know, financing of these kind of transactions is a bit tricky. In other states, there have been some funds, some CDFIs, specialized lenders that can access some small business funds, small business administration funds, and other sources that can help finance these kind of employee-owned cooperative conversions. Those don't really have a big presence in Iowa yet, although as we move ahead, hopefully those can be accessed, those out-of-state funds, and maybe eventually ones here. We've worked with the governor's office and the Economic Development Authority on brainstorming some ideas about what incentives can the state provide to assist here. Whether they can assist with some just investigations, studies, costs associated with putting the structure in place. That's what we have for employee stock ownership plans. The state has a grant program for that. Or maybe something a little beyond that, where perhaps the state can help with the initial capital contributions or subscriptions by the individual employees, or maybe eventually some sort of a loan fund that would help and provide financing there. Because you see why it's difficult for the traditional lenders to be involved here. Usually in the case of a small business buyout, where the local bank may be providing some financing, those lenders are going to be looking for someone to provide a personal guarantee in that case. And here, where you have the ownership kind of spread equally among a reasonable number of folks, it's kind of unreasonable and to expect personal guarantees from those folks who own just one share or one unit in that EOC. Sometimes we've seen it structured where the exiting owner will provide a limited personal guarantee in the case of a staged sell. But it's, again, it's a challenge we're working on, and it needs to be recognized as you move forward.
So that's a summary really of the types of work that we're doing on the legal end. And then really with respect to advising potential employee groups or transitioning owners, the third member of the team really needs to be a financial or a tax advisor on the very unique, and as Nick will explain, potential, but again, unique opportunities for tax benefits to both the employees and the transitioning owner if there is a transition to an employee-owned cooperative.
Right. So briefly, there are, the main benefits of a worker-owned co-op from a federal income tax point of view are twofold. There is the ability to avoid the double taxation that generally goes along with corporations at the federal tax level. And that's what producer co-ops and in many cases utility co-ops take advantage of. And then the other potential benefit is the deferral and potential exclusion of the gain on the sale of interest or stock in the company to an employer-owned co-ops. So let's talk a minute just about the cooperative tax treatment under federal income tax law. There was a time when worker co-ops were being formed, primarily, interestingly enough, with respect to plywood manufacturing businesses in the northwest part of the country, and they were fighting with the IRS about whether or not they could treat themselves as a co-op. They knew there were other producer co-ops and customer co-ops out there, but worker co-ops was sort of a novel new thing. And the IRS was not buying the argument by those professional advisors that these folks, the owners here, have this common tie of providing their labor as the shared connection with the entity, and that's creating a profit or a margin at the company level that should be able to be distributed back on a cooperative basis to those folks, just like farmers who sell grain to a producer co-op have the margin that's generated there at the company co-op distributed back to them under a special patronage type treatment. And so worker co-ops made that same argument. It was shot down by the IRS several times, but finally courts sanctioned it and said, yeah, it looks like it fits to us under the requirements of this of the common law dealing with co-ops. And then it was set forth in the statute by Congress, creating subchapter T of the Internal Revenue Code, which provides all the provisions with respect to patronage dividends and how that's treated. So in connection with worker-owned co-ops, again, the The patronage is the labor provided, the work provided by those employee owners. And if all your employees, all the labor that's provided is by member owners of the co-op, 100%, then all earnings of the company are treated as patronage earnings and are eligible to be distributed or reserved for owners. And that would be deductible by the corporation as a patronage distribution. And there will be no double taxation in that case. If only a portion of the contributed labor generating the earnings or margin of the business is provided by member owners of the co-op, then there has to be an allocation made, and only that portion attributable to the owner's work is patronage or earnings and available for that deduction. But remember, this was all before we had LLCs and the ease of flow-through taxation and flow-through entity treatment. So it was very important because larger organizations that wanted limited liability, or even smaller ones, had to form a corporation. If they, for whatever reason, proceeded or S corporation didn't work, there's a taxable C corporation there that is going to be subject to income tax at the corporate level, and then upon distributions, the shareholders are going to pay tax on the dividends, of course. But with the cooperative structure and subchapter T, you can avoid that double taxation with respect to that portion which is being patronage. In our world today, there's lots of ways in which we can avoid double taxation at the company level because we can elect to be a flow-through entity, a partnership, elect subchapter K treatment. So it may not be quite as critical, and you could form a limited liability company that is taxed as a flow-through partnership for federal income tax purposes, but still has all the concepts of cooperative features because a decision's been made by the selling owner and by the employee group. That's all good. It's good for culture. It's good for team morale, and that's why it's being done, not primarily for tax purposes, but for other purposes. And so that's certainly a possibility. But if you want the second advantage available for a big tax advantage that could be available in the case of an employee-owned co-op, then you're going to have to be a corporation for tax purposes that qualifies for subchapter T, cooperative treatment. And that's the section 1042 deferral. The special provision of the tax code, section 1042, provides for the deferral of gain triggered by the sale of securities or interests in a company to either an ESOP, which we're not talking about here, but just know that it's the same provision, or the eligible worker-owned co-op. So if an owner, in effect, converts the business to an employee-owned co-op, section 1042 may be available to defer the recognition and the payment of tax on that realized gain from the sale of his or her securities in the business. It's not an easy section to deal with. It's not as simple as just saying you don't have to pay tax this year and deal with it in the future, or don't deal with it at all. But instead, it incorporates this concept of continuing to have the dollars invested in something akin to an operating business. So there are special rules in there that say the amount that you sell the business for, the securities of the business for, have to be reinvested in qualified replacement securities. Those could be in a small operating company, but generally they would be in a large publicly owned company. Casey's, for example, or any other large public company that's operating a business. It can't be a passive type investment company. And then you basically got to transfer a basis of your low basis interest in your business that you sold, jumps over and becomes the basis of these replacement securities. and you just move ahead, enjoying perhaps the dividend distributions from your portfolio of replacement securities, or you certainly can borrow against those replacement securities on a margin loan or something else and enjoy some of the cash. Then eventually, if you dispose of those in a non-qualifying disposition, you're going to trigger the tax that was realized when you sold the securities of the business. But of course, what eventually happens to folks who have retired and sold their business is they move on, they die, and of course, we still have a step up in basis concept in the federal tax law for the time being anyway. So the step up in basis with respect to the heirs or recipients of those replacement securities, and then the unrecognized gain is wiped away, and the sale of the securities in the business at a gain is never taxed in that situation. So again, that's 1042. It's deserves more than that 2-minute summary, but again, if you have that situation, where we again here at the Drake Law School and the Drake Legal Clinic would be happy to consult with you and talk to you more about that.
I think really, just for your information, we've got that #1 in Iowa with Morning Bell Coffee Roasters. Part of our goal and having this discussion, raising this awareness and offering services is to increase that number as our small business owners retire, and it makes sense, and we increase those number of employee-owned cooperatives in the state of Iowa as compared to a lot of other states who have certainly more of those types of entities at work in their states. So we appreciate you listening to us here today, and I know that Megan's going to make sure you have our information. And currently, again, our forms and resource documents are available on Iowa SourceLink's website.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Nick and Debra, for sharing that information. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded and will be available to watch on our website or by searching Iowa SourceLink on YouTube within the next week. If your questions were not answered today, your questions will be emailed to Nick and Debra along with your contact information so that they can follow up with you. As a reminder, Iowa SourceLink does not provide a continuing education certificate for your attendance here today. We do, however, send out an email to everyone who participated within a few days after the webinar that you can use as proof of attendance. Our next webinar will be held on November 13th from noon to 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. The webinar will cover withholding income taxes and will be led by the Iowa Department of Revenue. Check out the registration link for more information by visiting iowasourcelink.com and navigating to our tax webinar page. Until next time, have a great rest of your day. Thank you, guys.